Recently, there was a debate between Joel Davis and some liberal named Drew Pavlou. I didn't watch the whole thing end to end, I skipped around a bunch, and it seemed to derail into a discussion about the existence of group differences and the possibility of the cohesion of a diverse liberal civic nation. I don't really care about that. The right has been schooling liberals on this matter since 2018, so there's no point in belaboring it. But what was really interesting here was the difference between the way Joel sees diversity and the way Drew, the shitlib, sees diversity.
Well, what diversity means, according to the common parlance, according to the definition that is adhered to by the people who rule us, diversity actually means more non-whites or more other types of minorities, maybe sexual minorities, like more homosexuals, more transgender people or whatever. But generally speaking, it means more non-whites. That's how they use it. But it's kind of ridiculous because to have diversity as a value, this implies two things. One, the term diversity means difference, basically. It means that we value difference. But at the same time, it's paired with this notion of inclusion or this notion of equality. And so it's saying on the one hand that we value difference, but on the other hand that we actually don't value any differences differently, that all differences are equal. And so in this way, it actually is kind of against the principle of diversity. It's saying we don't actually want to preserve any of these differences. We don't value any of these differences. People should be seen as though these differences don't exist and treated as though these differences don't exist. And we shouldn't try to do anything to preserve those differences. In fact, we should actively destroy those differences. So actually, the way that diversity is employed by the establishment is against diversity. It's saying, no, we don't actually value diversity at all. Someone like me who says we should keep people separate so that we can maintain their differences. Apparently, I'm an enemy of diversity, but actually, my ideology would actually preserve diversity, ironically. And this just kind of exposes the ridiculousness of the way this term is employed and the elevation of it as a value in our society. So the idea of being against diversity was about preserving the white man's land, that we would maintain white values, that we would maintain a white way of life, that we would maintain control of our own affairs, our own self-determination. This is the idea of nationalism. The notion of diversity is being employed in all white countries to destroy the capacity for whites to maintain control, maintain positions of power over the countries that we built and we founded. So it's always employed to basically elevate non-whites into positions of power and elevate non-whites into positions of prominent representation. So again, they don't actually value diversity. They want to undermine the diversity of our countries or of the world, of the human race, by basically dissolving white people into this soup, this racial and ethnic soup.
For Joel, diversity is about the preservation of the uniqueness of discrete groups. He argues that nationalism is the only way to ensure that this happens, unique groups maintaining sovereignty over their own territories, where they're free to continue their own ways of living undisturbed. This is an argument called differentialism, which was made popular probably by Alain de Benoit, and it's essentially the argument that I make myself. So if that's diversity, having unique cultures and a vibrant amount of difference around the world, what's the alternative? Let's hear what the shitlib has to say.
What I am arguing for is diversity in the sense that diversity has always existed. It is a fact of life. It is a feature of life. No two human beings are the same. No two human beings anywhere on earth are the same. You can have two people of the same, Aryan racial stock as Joel would have it, and they will have differences. They will have different morality. They'll have different intellectual attributes. They'll have different personalities. They'll have different likes, dislikes, interests. And so diversity is a feature of existence. Diversity is a feature of literally the universe. If you had to try and eradicate diversity, you would have a totally static universe where life is impossible. It's like trying to eradicate the dialectic. It's impossible. And so all of humanity, all of existence is characterized by diversity, the fact that people have different views, different talents, different interests. And I like diversity in the sense that I like being able to have a different opinion to, say, Joel, or have a different way of living my life to another person. I don't want anybody to be telling me how to live my life, what I should be doing. I don't want people to be interfering with my loved ones, with my family. I want to be left alone basically by the state. I don't believe in the types of, to create the world that Joel wants, which would involve the mass deportation of millions of people and obviously massive amounts of violence, including murder of millions of people.
What Drew is essentially doing here is denying the legitimacy or even existence of human groups. He says that diversity is just a fact of life, something every human has by virtue of being a distinct individual. If that's true, then as he says, there's no way to actually decrease diversity, and naturally there'd be no way to maintain it either. So what are they even debating about? This atomic individualist definition of diversity is quite close actually to the way postmodernists define it. And even though Drew claims to not be one of those extreme leftists trying to destroy the country, he agrees with their very view on this matter. Postmodernists believe that what we see as reality or as truth is a socially constructed set of consensus maintained by power, socially constructed by individuals specifically. Because of this, they've developed a skepticism of what they call meta-narratives. If truth is socially constructed by individuals, then it has no verifiable objective basis. Any attempt by an individual or by a group to assert his view as objective truth is therefore a groundless meta-narrative. Hence, postmodernism proceeds by deconstructing these views, and it holds skepticism toward those meta-narratives, which are simply viewed as the oppressive product of power relationships. Essentially, this all boils down to the position that, in order to preserve the multiplicity of different individual views, all meta-narratives have to be deconstructed. Charles Upton in System of Antichrist summed up the problem with it perfectly. Such arbitrarily constructed worldviews should be deconstructed in order to celebrate diversity and preserve the rights of marginalized minority constructions of reality, which of course, since they are two constructions, must also be deconstructed. So much for the preservation of minority rights. So postmodernism ends in deconstructionism, and deconstructionism ends, or hopefully will, in the deconstruction of deconstructionism. If the constructed view of the majority oppresses minorities, so minority views oppress individuals, and individual views, why not, the views of the subpersonalities within the individual, as those subpersonalities oppress the experience of split seconds of consciousness, etc. If we take them seriously, we will have to conclude that to exist at all is to oppress and to be oppressed, that the end of oppression must be the end of existence, that the final goal of postmodern nihilism is and should be annihilation. Maybe the word postmodernism really does refer to the termination of history, the end of time. So if we ignore that it just ends up in nihilism, the view of diversity that postmodernists offer is inherently individualist, just like Drew's. Groups are deconstructed, cultures are deconstructed, and so that all that's left in the end is the individual and his idiosyncrasies. Diversity then ceases to actually exist in any meaningful way. Individual distinction always exists, so there's no way to defend nor attack it. Given that Drew believes exactly what postmodernists believe, he is tacitly supporting the usage of this concept of diversity to dissolve unique groups, such as white people or white nations. If diversity is only individual difference, then groups do not exist. If groups do not exist, then there are no valid races or cultures, so the disappearance of a race or a culture is no real loss. There is still individual diversity. So not only does this atomic idea of diversity lead to anti-white racism, it also logically ends in genocide. The belief that races don't exist is already a linguistic or philosophical form of genocide, let alone the idea that distinct cultures don't even exist. What Drew holds onto is essentially an empty idea of diversity, which Joel rightly calls banal. What's actually at stake in this debate isn't individual diversity, but rather group diversity. The right for unique groups to exist and assert their way of life in the world. We're all born into groups and formed by them, by our culture, shared history, our religion, and our race. Individualism is an empty question. Even the idea of a diversity of individuals is suspect, because individual is a purely quantitative concept. An individual is something that only has number as a distinction. While you could claim that constitutes diversity, it's diversity without any qualities. Again, it's just empty. What Drew probably means to say is person, but as soon as we admit that these individuals are persons, then we also have to admit the validity of human groups, since persons have ancestry and families and shared customs. So if this diversity of individuals isn't diversity, then what is? What are the principles that underlie true diversity? One of the central problems with the postmodern and liberal notion of diversity is that it refuses to admit discreteness as a requirement for the existence of diversity. Diversity isn't just difference, but it's a difference of discrete categories. To illustrate why, think of TV static. TV static looks like a homogeneous image, and no one would look at it and think that it's a vibrant display of difference. But technically, in a purely quantitative level, it does contain diversity. Each pixel has a different shade. They're never in the same place at any given time. There's constant movement and variation. What exists in TV static is that you have a lot of difference, but those differences aren't in any way discrete nor categorical. It's just noise. The difference between a beautiful scene and TV static is that a scene has discrete categorical differences. I can identify a person, or a house, or a rainbow with such and such discrete qualities. If we move on to the plane of human differences, then we can see a clear difference between the globalized notion of atomic diversity, in which distinct cultures dissolve into a melting pot and lose their discreteness, and the nationalist vision of diversity, different peoples having their own unique homelands and ways of life. The melting pot is like the TV static. There's technically still difference, but the difference being individualized and turned into a melting pot has lost its discreteness. You can no longer identify any categories of person. What we care about when we say the word diversity is always the uniqueness of different ways of life, and those ways of life never exist in a vacuum and always differ between other groups. The reason why colonialism is criticized is because natives were uprooted from their unique groups, merged with Europeans, and then required to abandon their ancestral customs and beliefs. No anti-colonialist says the Europeans culturally enriched the natives with their diversity, and technically admixture increases the quantitative level of diversity in a population. But everyone looking on knows instinctively that the problem with colonialism is that it has destroyed qualitative diversity, which is the only definition of diversity that isn't banal, empty, or essentially human erasure. I've seen leftists try to argue against differentialism by pleading this very same atomic diversity, arguing that even if two populations were eliminated through admixture, that there would still exist a quantity of difference that could never go away. But what is being totally ignored is that entire peoples have been destroyed, turned into history, and they can never be recovered. If your definition of diversity can serve to defend genocide, then who's the real quote-unquote fascist? Drew argued that Joel's position of differentialist ethnonationalism is like the totalitarian ideologies of the 20th century, responsible for genocide and violence. But ethnonationalism is actually a historical default. The burden of proof is on liberals to show that their brand of immigration-based and market-based population and cultural erasure is somehow more enlightened than people drawing borders and trying to preserve their unique ways of life. And the biggest irony is that Drew says he just wants to be left alone. He just wants to express himself and be free from external oppression. How blind is he to not realize that that's exactly what nationalists want? Nationalists want their people to be free to express themselves, free from extermination and takeover by globalist ideologues and hostile foreigners. His biggest self-imposed roadblock is his refusal to recognize groups. Everyone in the world, except this handful of atomized liberals in the West, recognizes race and ethnicity. Throughout history, everyone recognized racial differences. Only Drew is too stubborn to budge, and as a result, he's totally blind to the state of the world and its zero-sum games. He thinks having two mutually exclusive, imperializing ethno-religions in one country, Islam and Judaism, is compatible with civic peace. He thinks that somehow Sharia law and liberal values can come to an agreement without oppression of one or the other. He lives in a total fantasy land. A fantasy that, taken to its logical conclusion, must end in some kind of erasure, whether it's the erasure of white people or even the erasure of global diversity as a whole. What it all boils down to is diverse ethno-nationalism versus homogenous globalism. Either you want unique nations with discrete peoples and cultures, or you want a world market where culture is stolen, destroyed, then commodified and prostituted out to the highest bidder. There's no middle ground here. Either you're for true diversity, or you're against it under the shadow of the Tower of Babel.